All right, welcome back, friends and comrades. I am here with Philipp Felsch, who's an author of a new forthcoming book coming out very soon on how Nietzsche came in from the cold, a tale of redemption. And this book really fits in line with my ongoing series, what I've titled New Directions in Nietzschean Studies. And one of the things I love about this book, Philipp, is that you fill in a gap in my understanding, and I think therefore perhaps in many readers of Nietzsche's understanding, of the behind the scenes, if that's the right phrase, process of the translation of Nietzsche in the Western countries following the Second World War. It's a book that tells the story of two Italian Nietzschean specialists, Montinari and Colli, and you'll learn all about these two very important philologists in this conversation. It's actually a book about much more than that. It's a book about the interpretive approach to Nietzsche and the battles that existed following the war. And it's a very important contribution that you've made, I think. And so, Philipp, could we begin by you just giving us a sense of your research and of your scholarship more generally?
First of all, let me say that I'm very glad that we're having this conversation, and I'm also happy that my book is coming out in English now. I think 2 years after it was published in German. I'm teaching. Actually, I'm a professor for cultural history in Berlin, in the Humboldt University, but I'm mainly interested in the history of ideas. Also, I was writing books about history of science in the past, so that is also somehow still around. So I was also in this book interested in the history of philology as, a method and a craft and a kind of scholarship. But I'm mainly interested in the history of ideas. And if I would try to specify what fascinates me, then I would rather say I'm interested in the social life of ideas, maybe. History of ideas for me doesn't mean to reconstruct, let's say, the internal argument of some given philosophy, so to be kind of inside the texts, inside the thoughts, but I'm more interested in the external aspect of thinking, in how ideas collide with the world, how ideas have shaped the world, but also how ideas look, how a certain philosophy has a certain style, inspires certain, existential feelings in their readers. Michel Foucault, in the late Foucault, in one of his small texts, he coined this great expression, which I like to claim for my own work. He talked about les reportages d'idées, so like the reporting of ideas as almost like a kind of a journalistic genre. And that's where I see myself. I want to see how ideas, philosophical ideas, are out there in the world, how they feel, how they create certain impulses, and how they look, if that makes sense.
And there's no better scholar to examine that than Nietzsche, precisely because he's so widely read, and there are so many competing approaches to him.
Exactly.
He's a figure that is people can claim that they own him on the left, on the right, maybe even the center. Although probably the political center would not be able to tolerate Nietzsche, because Nietzsche, in my view, has a very robust political vision, in fact. Even though the left will often say that he's anti-political, this concept of the anti-political Nietzsche. Philipp, could we ask you about Nietzsche for you? Everyone has a personal connection, I think, to him. There's a lot been written about Nietzsche seizing the youthful, the adolescent in us, Did you read him as a young person?
Really not. I tried to read Nietzsche in my early 20s when I was traveling in Mexico with a backpack. I carried the Zarathustra with me, his kind of, maybe most poetic book. Also, definitely not his best, I would say now. And I really hated the book, I have to say. The pathos, the language, I couldn't deal with that. Nietzsche, for me, I think I can say that very clearly, is in the end, or I discovered Nietzsche through the French Nietzscheans of the late 20th century. We will talk about them, namely through the writings of Michel Foucault and his specific kind of historical genealogy, his way of, going into the machinery of Western culture by digging up certain historical genealogies. And sooner or later, somebody who's interested in Foucault and his legacy, and where Foucault took its inspiration from lands with the writings of Nietzsche, the genealogy of morals, for example, Beyond Good and Evil, these writings from the 1880s. And in a way, I was fascinating that Nietzsche had already elaborated this whole program, of a certain kind of historical cultural critique. That's the Nietzsche that really fascinated me, on the one hand, because I'm myself, I'm not a philosopher, I'm a historian, although, I'm interested in the history of philosophical thought, but I always operate within a historical framework. That's just the way how I look at the world, I guess. The second aspect that somehow fascinates me with Nietzsche is maybe more personal, more existential. Nietzsche always works around this difference. Thomas Mann actually claimed that the main incentive of Nietzsche's whole oeuvre, the difference, the antagonism between life on the one hand and, let's say, scholarship or spirit, the whole idealistic tradition, and these two antagonists he constantly sets into play. Life as something original, something wild, maybe, which has to do with force, with brute force, maybe even, and is opposite to every kind of idealizing or, delving yourself into historical scholarship and so on. And given as such, this difference maybe is fairly crude, like if you want to build, let's say, for example, a politics on this Nietzschean notion of life, it turns out pretty scary, actually, I think. We'll talk about Nietzsche as a political thinker, but within scholarship, within the intellectual life, if you take this antagonism between life and spirit within scholarship, then Nietzsche somehow becomes an incredibly inspiring author, somebody who tells you to reject every kind of dead knowledge, what professors tell you, to really think for yourself, to follow your own inspiration. So I think that's why to read Nietzsche, also because he has this very specific, very energetic style, is incredibly inspiring within scholarship, within reading and thinking and being an intellectual. The moment you step outside of that sphere and articulate yourself, or you enter the political sphere, I think Nietzsche is definitely in our days extremely problematic. But within the intellectual sphere, he is incredibly inspiring for every aspiring writer and thinker, and that's why he was inspiring for me as well.
Yeah, no original idea was ever penned sitting down, only in the free and open air, right? Exactly. And that's a very interesting point for a philologist, somebody trained in philology, who's the most scholarly form. That's what they're doing, is they're living in texts. Yet somehow Nietzsche, even biographically, actually, a lot of people may not know this, but Nietzsche took long walks every day. even though he was in poor health. And he actually traveled quite a lot. So that notion of movement and that notion of the aphorism as an inspiration for an intellectual is undeniable, undeniable. Added to which his stylistics, his style of writing is so literally seductive. So it's what I argue is that Nietzsche is a great community builder. He kind of builds a sort of cadre of passionate, like Lou Salome says, he writes to convert. Then the question is, what are you being converted to? That almost stands as kind of a question, you know? Okay, let us now turn to.
Can I say one more thing
Please.
to what you just said?
Sure.
Which is also, especially within the German intellectual tradition, I think a gesture of amazing importance through the whole 20th century. Nietzsche was a professor of philology, but he rejected this professorship. He gave it up because for him, in the end, thinking could not happen on an academic chair. So ever since Nietzsche, I mean, before Nietzsche, we have Schopenhauer, who never got a professorship, but who spent half of his life writing against the professor Hegel. But definitely, ever since Nietzsche, renounced his professorship, we have this deep rift, this deep chasm within at least German-speaking academic or intellectual life, between the academic and the anti-academic. And even within academia, the anti-academic impulse, to kind of rub yourself or fight against the conventions of the disciplines and the academic life has become such an important resource for intellectual, inspiration and innovation. And so the whole institutional history of Nietzsche and the universities also, I find that very fascinating.
Yeah, I find that very valid, and I even would say a public philosopher like Sloterdijk, who I see as an heir to Nietzsche. I think that Sloterdijk is very, very Nietzschean, deeply so. And I think actually some of his conclusions about Nietzsche, I find to be incredibly sound. But you see, he's a philosopher who, like Nietzsche, kind of lives beyond the university, I would say. Yes. And that's also why, by the way, this criticism to the university, like all things in Nietzsche, I always try to say, even you can criticize many things in him, but you have to understand that there's always what I call a noble kernel. There's something very redeeming about this vocation of thinking outside of the academy, right? Something very correct about that. Okay. Perhaps we could begin, Philip, with the understanding from you, if you could elaborate for us. Bring us back to the moment of the rise of fascism in Italy and in Germany. We know famously that both Hitler and Mussolini had a love affair with Nietzsche themselves. We also know that many Nietzschean scholars will point out numerous examples of their vulgar and sort of bastardized readings of Nietzsche. So that's a whole other question. But within the left, in France and in Italy, I think to set the story, to set the ground of the new interpretation that emerges, we have to understand how the left was using Nietzsche to fight the fascists. How did that work? And could you give some examples of the kind of attempts on behalf of the left, communists, in fact, to use Nietzsche against fascism?
I mean, the fact that both the extreme right and the extreme left in the first half of the 20th century were able to extract ideas from Nietzsche that somehow suited their political endeavors shows or tells a lot about Nietzsche as a political thinker. He is not easy to grasp. Nobody will ever convincingly tell me, or prove to me whether Nietzsche was actually a right-wing or a left-wing thinker. He's both. And and he can be used for both. You said it initially. He was very anti-liberal in many ways, definitely not a Democrat. On the other side, nobody ever thought individual freedom so radically through as Nietzsche did. So Mussolini was an avid, the young Mussolini, when he was still, a journalist up to First World War, was a Nietzsche reader. He loved Nietzsche. So were anarchists in Italy and in other European countries. And as a matter of fact, Mussolini came from the left. In the 20s, you also have this blossom of, Nietzsche cults, smaller or bigger, and they tend to be, there are also Nietzsche cults on the left, but I would say predominantly Nietzsche in the first half of the 20th century is more of a right-wing phenomenon. He's closer in his, reception to fascism and everything that surrounds it. Interestingly, if we take the Italian case, which is most important for my book, because we're dealing with two Italian anti-fascists. There's a cliche that Italian fascism was philosophically, mainly driven or ideologically legitimized by Nietzsche, which is not true. The mature Mussolini in the course of the 20s, and then definitely in the 30s, moves from Nietzsche to Hegel. Giovanni Gentile, who was for a short while the Minister of Education under Mussolini, and later in the 30s the kind of official, philosopher of fascism, was a Hegelian and a historicist. So the moment Mussolini, builds a state with a party and a very hierarchical, institutional system, he's not a Nietzschean anymore. He's a Hegelian. He thinks that fascism, is a step, or maybe also a solution within a certain movement within human history. So in this context, Nietzsche can always be turned against Italian fascism. Nietzsche can be turned against fascism also in other contexts. For example, in France, and maybe you're alluding, among other things, at this French secret society Acéphale of the late 30s, mainly initiated by Georges Bataille, the French philosopher, but many of his important philosophical contemporaries were part of it. The mission of Acéphale was to reclaim Nietzsche against the German fascists, reclaiming Nietzsche and founding a kind of anti-fascist thought and also, action program on Nietzsche. Bataille's idea was exactly that you can't fight fascism with pure reason, by recalling the ideas of enlightenment, but you can only fight fascism, the fascist mysticism, with building a counter myth. So for that matter, something, by the way, also Roland Barthes wrote about in his mythology after the war, that you can only counter a certain mythology with a counter mythology, otherwise it won't work. Just to claim and reclaim pure reason will not help you. And that was the mission of Acéphale, to reclaim Nietzsche as the thinker of radical freedom, radical denial of any kind of authority, and as a matter of fact, in that way, an deeply anti-fascist thinker. If we think of fascism as a deeply authoritarian regime, that was the idea of Georges Bataille and his compatriots in France. We have something similar, much smaller, much lesser known, in Italy. And I tell the story of this small circle of one teacher and his pupils in Lucca in the early 40s in Tuscany. And that's kind of the nucleus of this whole story of the Nietzsche edition and Colli and Montinari.
Yes, thank you very much. We'll come back to the French attempt to combat fascism at the site of Nietzscheanism, which of course looks very different by the time we get to the post-war period, right? Because I think that the fascist menace was defeated, yet on the ashes of that, right, we still have the anti-fascist Nietzscheanism that emerges now retooled as a modality for as a philosophy for the left as such, which I think is an interesting pivot, which we can examine later. But bring us into Giorgio Colli's teaching. Who was he? He himself was a philologist. He was an expert in ancient Greek. He himself, tell us what, maybe, did he have a political, you talk about it in the book, but perhaps you could give us a sense of his political compass, as well as how did he see Nietzsche himself?
Colli comes from Turin, Torino, in the Italian industrial metropolis in northern Italy. Let's say the nucleus of late 19th century Italian industrialization, the head of the huge Fiat factories, the car factory. And so Turin is, let's say, a hotspot of Italian modernity in early 20th century. Colli comes from an upper class, bourgeois upper class family. His father is a fairly well-known, fairly established liberal journalist who loses his job under Mussolini in the early 30s. So Colli belongs to a progressive liberal left-wing bourgeois milieu, out of which many important and famous progressive and left-wing Italian intellectuals and writers have emerged of the post-war period. Cesare Pavese, for example, and the extremely important publishing house of Einaudi, who is in a way the flagship of progressive Italy after the war. Colli somehow belongs into this circle, but in a certain way he's also different. Whereas Pavese or Ginsburg and all these progressive thinkers who at the same time are founders of this Einaudi publishing house, whereas they discover, in the case of Pavese, for example, American modernism, American literature in the 30s, to go into kind of inner exile within Italian fascism and experiment with literary modernism, Colli discovers the ancient Greek. And together with the ancient Greek, he discovers the German tradition of Grecophilia, which has been running strong since the 18th century, to kind of this idealizing movement of Greek culture as opposed to Roman culture, as opposed to mere politics, liberalism, democracy. This Grecophilia tradition within the German sense is deeply anti-political in a way. It holds culture as the much higher, truly human realm against, let's say, the lowlands of politics. So Colli embraces this. He teaches his, do you say pupils? The pupils, right?
Sure.
The kids in school, pupils.
Yeah.
His pupils, to which also a certain Montinari belongs, who was 15 at the time. Colli is in his mid-20s, a young teacher in this provincial Tuscan town of Lucca. He teaches, and we're now in the early 40s, so in deep in fascism, Second World War, which has not come to Italy yet, but will soon. He teaches ancient Greek authors, reads Platon, and urges them to also learn ancient Greek and German at the same time, to be able to read the important German interpreters of this Grecophilia tradition and the Greek authors, namely, or in the first place, most important for Colli, Nietzsche. And at the same time, I mean, it's kind of a paradox, because what Colli teaches is to detest politics as such. Politics is low, you have to kind of escape into the higher regions of culture and of the spirit, as his, in his version of the Greek, the ancient Greek, and also of Nietzsche's writing, of the early Nietzsche, show. But at the same time, he inspires in his pupils a strong anti-fascist vocation, which is not completely singular. If you go to Germany, for example, and think about another Nietzschean secret society, the Georges circle, the circle of Stefan George, the German poet, he was also inspired by Nietzsche. He thought, in a way, George thought he was, the reincarnation of Nietzsche, who finally gets done what Nietzsche only wrote about, namely, as you said before, as you put it so well, to form like a community of like-minded spirits, to really kind of start a new kind of society and engineer a cultural revolution. Also from this circle, although George detested politics as such, also from this circle in the 40s come a handful of people who are part of the resistance against Hitler. Stauffenberg, for example, who tried to kill Hitler. I mean, he comes from this kind of reactionary anti-fascism within Germany, but he also comes from this George Nietzschean tradition. The same happens in Italy with the Colli circle. The teacher teaches his pupils to, completely aim for the highest region of the spirit and to, completely keep out of politics. At the same time, he turns them into anti-fascists. And that goes all the way to some of them when in the 40s, the German army is invading Italy because the Italians have gotten rid of Mussolini in 43, and the Americans are starting to, conquer Italy from the south. Then half of this group goes into the armed guerrilla forces, the Resistenza in the mountains, and the younger ones, such as Montinari, who was one of the pupils in this circle of Nietzsche readers, he kind of organizes anti-fascist rallies within his hometown of Lucca and is thrown into jail for that matter also. So that's the starting scene of this very particular relationship between the teacher Colli and his 10-year-old younger pupil Montinari, a Nietzsche reading circle of the ancient Greek authors who understands itself as deeply anti-fascist.
Wow, thank you. So Montinari and Colli bring us to the moment of the inception of the idea. Where did it emerge from? To go into the Goethe and Schiller archive, where Nietzsche's material resided. Talk about the condition of Nietzsche's writings, how much of it had been released, how much of it had not been released. Perhaps you could also here mention which you talk about in the book, of the Elizabeth Forster administration of the Nietzsche material. So tell us about the status of Nietzsche's writings purely from the archive. What was the status before Colli and Montinari go in there? And why did they go in there?
Yes. So let's jump into the post-war scene to Germany. But not only to Germany, but after 45, be it Italy, be it Germany, Nietzsche is a done deal. Nietzsche, Hitler famously gave Mussolini to his 60th birthday shortly before he was kicked out of power by this palace coup in 1943. Hitler decided that his birthday gift to Mussolini's 60th birthday should be, like a 40-volume collected works of Nietzsche bound in blue pig leather, I think. This also went through the press, so that was the last proof you needed of how contaminated Nietzsche was. So after 45, Nietzsche is obviously, and for most readers, or non-readers, let's say, for the general public, Nietzsche is a fascist thinker. That's the predominant interpretation of Nietzsche. At the same time, there's a second story which unfolds in the course then of the 50s, at least in West Germany, that actually the fascist Nietzsche might not be the real Nietzsche. It might be a forged and distorted Nietzsche. So, who might have distorted and forged Nietzsche? The answer: his sister, Elizabeth. You mentioned her name, the infamous Elizabeth. Now we have to go back quickly to the late 19th century. As many of our listeners will know, Nietzsche lost his mind in 1889, right? And spent the last 10 years of his life in custody of his sister and his mother. And ironically, or sadly, his world fame, or let's say his Europe-wide fame, set in during this last decade of the 19th century while he was still alive, but he was not able to notice anymore what was going on. But his sister took care of this emerging fame, let's say. I mean, there's also a way of turning her into pure evil, which is maybe not even the truth, But so Elizabeth did many good things for Nietzsche's legacy. She collected everything that he had, written. And there were amazing, huge amounts of unpublished material that were basically left in his room in Turin when he, hugged a horse and then lost his mind. So the sister took care that all of this was collected and slowly also edited. And so she did a lot of good for the legacy of his brother. At the same time, we have to say first that this was also driven by a clear wish to monetize, this stuff could be sold. Suddenly Nietzsche turned into like a best-selling author, and the sister was feeding the growing appetite for Nietzsche with these annual little publications, snippets from posthumous writings and stuff. So she really systematically built up the Nietzsche fame. Also after his death, he died in 1900. And she started to publish the first, let's say, collected editions of Nietzsche's works. And she published widely from his posthumous writings. Namely, she published the book that was most famous and also most widely read, Nietzsche's book in the first half of the 20th century, The Will to Power, which became somehow his main oeuvre. Although it has never been published by himself. It was published in 1901 for the first time, and it was a collection, a curated collection of his posthumous writings with a systematic order, and it claimed to be the systematic philosophy that Nietzsche himself had never written. And the whole story of the Nietzsche reception in the first half of the 20th century has to be told through The Will to Power, because that was his most important book, because it seemed to reveal, the core of his philosophy. Elizabeth was also an admirer of Mussolini and Hitler. So she plays a strong role in turning Nietzsche into a right-wing author, and also in, handing him over to the fascists. She was She was actively lobbying Mussolini and also Hitler, and she was very successful in that. The Nietzsche archive that she founded in Weimar received grants from Mussolini and also from Hitler. He visited there, famous photographs. So was the Nietzsche definitely the Nietzsche of will to power? But was the Nietzsche who was read by the fascists, who delivered like core ideas to the fascists? Was he actually Elizabeth's Nietzsche, a forgery, a distortion? That's the, let's say, hermeneutics of suspicion that surrounds the Nietzsche reception after the war. And there were those who said, we're holding on to Nietzsche, people who had read Nietzsche as an anti-fascist author during the war, like Colli and Montinari, like Georges Bataille in France and his pupils and others. They were holding on to Nietzsche, but that was connected to the claim that the real Nietzsche still had to be discovered. And the distortions that went back, that Elizabeth, the sister, was responsible for, had to be removed. So the question of the Nietzsche interpretation and his political, let's say, legacy connected to the philological question of the Nietzsche edition. This is a kind of a complicated story. That's why I'm extending so far, so long. We have to say one more thing. Where were the unpublished Nietzsche papers that anybody who wanted to republish Nietzsche, unravel the will to power to see the material that it was curated from, had to go to Eastern Germany. The GDR, founded as a state in 1949, the communist German state. The Nietzsche papers, and we're talking about heaps and heaps and heaps and heaps of papers, 10,000s of pages that had largely never been published. Wow. And they were in Weimar under communist, within the communist realm of power. And whoever wanted to, undo or redo the state of the Nietzsche edition had to go there. And West Germans basically were not allowed.
And they were guarded by the communists, and the communists. Tell me about their view on Nietzsche. I assume their view was extreme caution, because I interviewed Jeffrey Waite, who's a Nietzsche scholar in America, and he said he's one of the first Americans to be allowed in. But he said, you know what he said? He said the communist security at the archive would interview you for a minimum of 3 hours, and they would quiz you about your interpretation of Nietzsche. And if they got the impression that you had a fascist agenda, you were not allowed in. Which is interesting, because you show that Montinari was followed by the security forces throughout the whole process. Tell us about this. Am I correct? What was their view? They were extreme caution?
Yes. I mean, also here, as always, Nietzsche and his person and his writings and his legacy was surrounded by many, many myths. Somehow it doesn't go without when it comes to Nietzsche, right? Just because his life and his writing and his character was so extraordinary, I assume. So first of all, generally in the West, among Western Nietzsche scholars who existed after the war, also in West Germany, think of Heidegger, think of Löwit, Karl Löwit, also a famous Nietzsche scholar from the 30s who had written very important interpretations about Nietzsche in the 30s, and Karl Schlechter, who is responsible for the first kind of abridged Nietzsche edition after the war. they all claimed that Nietzsche's writings were basically unavailable in the East. The communists had either transported them to Moscow on trucks, which initially they also wanted to do. So the Soviets, they really collected a lot of cultural material in the conquered territories in the East and shipped it to Moscow as, you know, art and cultural heritage movables. As we know now, even better than then. And also the Nietzsche papers were already loaded on trucks, you know, and ready to be brought to Moscow. But then last minute, some local politician intervened, and these crates, these like, I don't know, like 100 huge wooden crates filled with paper were unloaded again. And for a few days, they stood, you know, in the snow on the street, guarded by Red Army soldiers. So that's also a very specific scene in this in the history of Nietzsche's reception through the 20th century. As a matter of fact, West Germans were generally not allowed in, because in these years we have a strong we have a strong antagonism, at least on the official level, between the two German states. You know, somebody like Heidegger or like Löwit or Schlechter would have never been allowed in because they were fierce anti-communists, you know.
Right.
So
and you
Heidegger,
even say that Heidegger was, I think you say he was initially willing to advise the Colli Montinari project, but then he backed out, referring to the project as the communist version, or the communist project.
Exactly.
Which is actually unfair if you understand Colli, because Colli ideologically is not, ideologically Colli is probably most in line with the pure Nietzscheanism. So you see my point. His followers may be communists, but that doesn't mean that his approach is somehow marked by some agenda. I would say his agenda is this sort of mystical, philological duty to preserve the pure. So is that correct? Was Heidegger wrong about that? Is the collected works of the critical edition of Montinari and Colli, could you accuse it of having a communist agenda?
It's absurd. It's absurd. I mean, although yes, Colli was in many ways not even so far from Heidegger. You know, Heidegger was also a lover of the ancient Greek. They would have agreed on, definitely not on everything, but on many things. Montinari, it's true, he was a member of the Italian Communist Party and stayed a member up to his death. But ever since, okay, let's say if Montinari would have been an ardent communist throughout his life, he would have never touched Nietzsche again. You know, he went into he became a member, party member in the late 40s. The Italian Communist Party was a party of intellectuals, let's say the most glamorous, also the most tolerant and intellectually stimulating of the communist parties of West Europe. That was the Communist Party in Italy. So most of the intellectuals went into the aspiring intellectuals went into the Communist Party in the late 40s and early 50s. So did Montinari. But then they, of course, all had to face communism's major crisis, first major crisis in 1956, the uprising in Hungary, the whole process of de-Stalinization, and many communists left the cause. Many Western communists left the cause. And also Montinari, he stayed within the party, but he became critical. You know, he became, somehow he saw also that for 10 years he had kind of been following an ideology, a closed ideology, and he became a critical communist. And at that time, he rediscovers Nietzsche, his love of his youth, you know, reading with Colli. One of the two editors of this edition, yes, indeed, he was a communist, but he had no intention to fake, you know, to make another forgery and turn Nietzsche into communism, into a
Right.
communist. So and you wouldn't find traces of that in the whole Colli Montinari edition. What, of course, if anything, and an Italian and that accusation has been raised because Colli and Montinari, they were convinced that Nietzsche was not a fascist thinker. So if anything, you could say that they left out of their edition a few, like very incriminating passages of Nietzsche.
Yeah.
So if anything, a left wing Nietzschean, as in fact the Italian philosopher Giovanni Losurdo, who was a communist, he made that claim in the 90s that actually the Colli Montinari edition somehow turned Nietzsche into an anti-fascist, maybe a bit more than he actually was. But definitely, communist edition, what Heidegger said, is just purely ridiculous. It's part of the culture wars of the Cold War.
Right. Exactly. So that is very helpful. It gives me a nice bridge now to link the Italian philological approach of Montinari and Colli and plug that into the French new post-war interpretation, which I think, as you mentioned, everyone, the whole world has been seized by Deleuze. And in 1962, there's a conference, I think it's 62, maybe 64.
64.
Royal Mount. And then this conference, Montinari and Colli, they attend. And the Renaissance, we can call the Renaissance of the French Nietzschean post-war, people call the, Deleuze and Deleuze's book, Nietzsche and Philosophy. I always say this, Cornel West, the great American philosopher, says it is the Bible of postmodernism. So the French tell us a little bit about their version of Nietzsche. I know their version of Nietzsche takes many forms, but could you say some singular aspects of it, and how Colli and Montinari? You say Colli and Montinari were just listeners at that conference, but what do you think that they thought of this new approach? Because Deleuze was a protege of Bataille's circle in some sense, right? As a young, he was kind of like the new voice of a new generation of Nietzschean interpretation. And in reality, I think that he fulfilled, he brought Nietzsche into a completely new framework, a radically different framework than Colli, I think it must be said.
I think it's helpful to compare the two big waves of Nietzscheanism in the 20th century. There's a first big wave in the 20s and 30s. It has a tendency to be politically right-wing. We said it before. But it is, if you try to, define like a core character of this whole bulk of Nietzsche's scholarship and obsession and inspiration, it is connected to the attempt to turn Nietzsche into a real philosopher. If you look at least within the German context, but these interpretations were also, circulated also in France, definitely in France and in Italy, where there was an early Nietzsche following. If you take Heidegger's interpretations, if you take Karl Löwitz's interpretations, those were very, very important in these interwar times. They try to turn Nietzsche into a real philosopher, which means they try to unveil in these many aphoristic, somehow very fluid books that Nietzsche wrote, and they try to unearth let's say, the systematic thought behind it, usually arriving at one central principle or maybe two. That's why the Nietzsche of the post-war decade is either the Nietzsche of the eternal return, that was Karlowitz's point, or it's the Nietzsche of the will to power, or it's the Nietzsche of the superhuman. All these kind of, famous claims that Nietzsche had made, but the important interpretations from the 30s, they somehow try to turn these labels into, kind of the core of systematic philosophy. Heidegger kind of connects all of them, the will to power, the eternal recurrence, superhuman. That's kind of the triangle, the systematic triangle of Nietzsche's thought. And that's also why we can understand that the posthumously published book, The Will to Power, was so important for all these philosophers. For Heidegger, it stayed the most important book, The Will to Power, that Elisabeth, the sister, had edited. Now, if we move, and then we have in the middle of the century, there's kind of a low tide around Nietzsche. He's considered to be a fascist. Nietzsche, many people that think that Nietzsche is over. Habermas, for example, the West German philosopher, wrote in 1968 that, thank God, Nietzsche is finished, is over. Nobody's interested in Nietzsche anymore. And a few years later, there he comes again. So the second wave of Nietzscheanism is a French Nietzscheanism, and it blooms and blossoms mainly in the 70s and the 80s, and it starts in the 60s. And in a way, it is just the opposite of the first Nietzsche wave. It has a tendency towards the left, although it abandons and helps abandon many leftist core ideas and turns the left into something else. That is what you have written about, among other things. And second, for these French thinkers, Nietzsche, they don't try to turn Nietzsche into a systematic philosopher. They're interested in how far Nietzsche kind of imploded philosophy from within. And that is that means they're interested in how far Nietzsche exploded the whole tradition of philosophy and philosophical writing, by finding a completely new form of writing. So for them, and mainly now I'm talking about Foucault and Derrida, who are maybe even more interesting in my story than Deleuze, but there are also many similarities. For them, Nietzsche is mainly, let's say, an event in the history of language, because Nietzsche destroys the language game of philosophy. He does something completely new, and by destroying the language game of philosophy, he's interested in what these post-structuralist philosophers, as they're soon to be called, are most interested in. And that connects them with literary modernism of late 19th and early 20th century, how the categories of bourgeois subjectivity, and that also includes the whole tradition of Western philosophy, how they actually already came to an end or can be buried within a new kind of thinking and writing. And that's why Nietzsche for them is so important, because he blew into the air the categories of authorship, of even writing books in the classical sense, and of the philosophical discourse, by establishing a whole different kind of writing. And that's where I'm just saying that already here, but maybe you want to step in between also. That's where suddenly philology becomes important again, and the question of the Nietzsche edition becomes important, because for the French philosophers, the posthumous Nietzsche, the Nietzsche who didn't write books but just scribbled manically in his notebooks, mixing all different kinds of genres. He excerpted from books that he read. He drafted first versions of his aphorisms, but he also wrote, his laundry lists and shopping lists. These kind of heterogeneous, this kind of vast bulk of heterogeneous text for the French philosophers was paradigmatic for how Nietzsche kind of exploded the philosophical discourse from within. And that's where the Colli and Montinari edition became interesting for them.
Yeah. And this is where we get things like Derrida, who says, and I will say, I find reading these French authors on Nietzsche very, very stimulating. The question as to how all of that gets infused into the left, that's another matter. But let's just examine what they say. You're probably familiar with this precise point of "I have forgotten my umbrella" by Derrida, which was a posthumous fragment which Derrida confesses could actually mean really nothing, because part of the posthumous fragments included like Nietzsche's chores or like his grocery list. It was very mundane things combined with phrases that could have a very profound, almost like a puzzle piece. So you think of like a complex puzzle. The fragments were these little pieces that the scholars could piece together. And Foucault says the objective is to deform this content and to mold it. And he even says against the philologists, if that makes them upset, then I don't care. Why do you think Foucault says that? We know that the notion of the author and the decentered metaphorical basis of Nietzsche is so central. But why? Why do you think this is the heart of this creativity? I know you mentioned it before, but could you perhaps give us your thought on this? Because you're right, Nietzsche is both the center of redefining the left, but he's also a philosophical figure that liberates them as philosophers in relationship to the canon of philosophy as such. And they use the posthumous fragments, but Colli probably was horrified by what they did to Nietzsche, or no? Because Absolutely. It seems to me that say more about that, please.
Okay. So we have a post-war French philosophy, which is interested in a new philosophy of, we could call it a philosophy of difference. They are deconstructing all kinds of entities and unities that in the Western tradition have become important. The notions of an oeuvre, like a book, a system of thought. But most important, of course, the whole idea of subjectivity that goes back to Descartes, of subjective intentions, and the idea of a certain subjective unity. So they apply their, let's say, weapon of deconstruction in the wider sense, not only in the Derrida sense, to all these central concepts of Western philosophy. And then there is Nietzsche, somebody who left this bulk of writing, which consists of a very messy melange of different kinds of texts, excerpts, shopping lists, poetic attempts, systematic, like philosophical ideas. But nobody has ever seen this, let's say, volcanic eruptions of Nietzsche's thoughts as they are in his notebooks, until the two Italians, Colli and Montinari, come and start their new edition from the archive in the GDR, and they find a French publisher very soon. Gallimard steps in. They need finance. Gallimard says, yes, we have Nietzsche is on the rise here in France already in the 60s again. And we would be interested to publish a new collected works of Nietzsche based on the archive, based on a one-to-one translation of the chaos of Nietzsche's notebooks. And Gallimard wins two aspiring young French philosophers as co-editors of this French Nietzsche edition, namely Deleuze and Foucault. So first of all, we can say through the Colli Montinari edition, Foucault becomes even acquainted with how these notebooks that Nietzsche left behind looks. He couldn't know before because they were never published in this form. And then he is, a part of this editorial team, but from the start there are, problems because Foucault is not really interested. He's never there. He's in Northern Africa and Tunisia, and he doesn't appear to the editorial meetings and so forth. And 2 years later, in 1968, I think he resigns from his post. And we get to know pretty quickly why, because in the same year he publishes his famous article, What is an Author?
Yeah.
And his famous article, What is an Author, answers to the text that his fellow philosopher Roland Barthes had published the year before, The Death of the Author.
Right.
The death of the author means burying basically the Western subject as it has dominated Western philosophy. And the author is one, let's say, incarnation of the Western subject. The author who has certain intentions and then puts them into a certain text. Foucault makes the claim in his text, What is an Author, that basically texts don't have an author in that sense, because texts are always a mix of different voices. They always, refer to texts that have already been written. They always inscribe themselves into a certain discourse that culture allows. Very often, they also appropriate other ideas without saying so. And let's say the paradigm of this kind of writing or écriture without an author are these posthumous notebooks of Nietzsche, because there you really have a stream of writing which doesn't have an author in the classical sense, because everything is mixed. Nietzsche just quotes, he just copies quotes from the authors that he reads, but sometimes without quotation marks. So it's really hard to discern what is Nietzsche's own ideas, what comes from the authors that he read. And then we have all these mundane, like everyday jottings that are also in the notebook. So Foucault, in his text, What is an Author, takes the example of Nietzsche to show that the Western idea of authorship actually doesn't exist. Nietzsche is just an extreme example. And that is something that he knows because he was, on the editorial board of the Colli Montinari edition. So he basically claims, by looking into these notebooks of Nietzsche, we can see that an author with the name of Nietzsche, in a way, never existed.
Yeah.
Now, with this, he runs completely counter the intentions of Colli and Montinari, because they have a completely different incentive with their edition. They want to, in a way, for the first time, as they see it, they want to get rid of the forgeries and the distortions of Nietzsche's sisters to make Nietzsche's own voice audible for the first time. That's kind of their ethical mission, to finally give Nietzsche or give back his own voice to Nietzsche. So they're exactly interesting in reconstructing the authorial voice of Nietzsche.
Yeah.
So whatever the French philosophers are doing with their edition, be it Foucault in his text What is an Author, be it Jacques Derrida with his deconstruction of this one sentence, I have forgotten my umbrella, which Montinari took out of one of the notebooks and copied it into his edition with quotation marks, because this sentence is in quotation marks in Nietzsche's notebooks.
Right.
So Derrida says we have no way of knowing what this is. Like, is it an idea that Nietzsche had himself? Did he actually forget his umbrella? Is it a quote from something that he read? Derrida again takes this example from Nietzsche's posthumous notebooks to show how absurd it is to try to isolate an author's voice of the author of Nietzsche. And that runs exactly counter to the ideas of Colli and Montinari, who wanted to restitute and recover or redeem Nietzsche's own authorship.
It's very interesting because in your book, you show that we know and we talk a lot about, on the left, the May 68 moment as a somehow pivotal moment. Pivotal because it's largely failed. Pivotal also because many authors have shown that it gave birth to a type of new philosophy, a new direction of the left, much of which was inspired by the incorporation of Nietzsche within French leftism. But what you show is that in 1977, you had what many people refer to as a kind of libertarian socialist uprising. And then you show, I don't know if you have an image, Philip, but it would be interesting if there was an image. I was looking for one, I couldn't find it. That the young people that protested in 77 in Italy wrote Zarathustra on graffiti. And that then you show that Montinari said he was concerned. And I think that, to paraphrase, Montinari says, I've helped give birth to a new vision of leftist philosophy that is combining elements of conservatism with elements of the left. My question is sort of, speak about that, if you would. Why was Montinari concerned? Because he had recently released an Italian translation of Zarathustra. But my question was, wouldn't he be happy? Wouldn't he be? But no, you said he was a little hesitant. Why?
So in Italy, in the 70s, we have, as in many other countries, definitely in West Germany, we have post-68, a split of the left. I mean, we have the split goes back definitely even further to the late 50s, early 60s. We have the old left, the communists who go back to the interwar period, sometimes even further, if we think of Germany, to the workers' movement of the 19th century, the Social Democratic Party, and so forth. And then we have the formation of the new left, basically, which is also a generational chasm. The new left, is consists of a younger generation, mainly, but not only, of students. It coincides with the student movement. And the new left, parts of the new left, discover Nietzsche, mainly, I would say, in the course of the 70s, definitely so in Italy. So Nietzsche in the late 70s suddenly becomes à la mode, and is quoted and also tagged more and more. And the new left in the 70s in Italy, as in West Germany, but in Italy even in a wider way, resorts to the means of violence. We have in Italy a left-wing terrorism. We also have a secret fascist terrorism. The Italians call the 70s gli anni di piombo, the leaden years, the years of lead. So no other Western countries has a higher death count of which are the radical left and the radical right responsible. And the terrorists and also this whole field of the new radical left in Italy, who likes to quote Nietzsche, they are anarchist, maybe nihilist. They gave up the idea of a socialist revolution. They are, they criticize, they think that they criticize the society of the liberal democracy in an even more fundamental way than Marx could have ever done it. And Montinari, who is still a member of the Communist Party, detests that, as basically all the Italian communists do in the 70s, because the Italian communists in the 70s, they are part of what is then called Euro-communism. So they are holding on to a legalist course, a democratic course that tries to change liberal democracy from within. It's called in Italy historical compromise. The communists are thinking about entering a coalition with the Christian democracy to have a large majority, to institute certain, fundamental changes of social policy in Italy and so forth. And Montinari is backing this, but the radical new left incites violence against this course. And then the historical compromise never happens, because the leader of the Christian Democratic Party, Aldo Moro, who kind of wants to steer this course, and let's say non-cynical politician from all we know, non-cynical Christian Democrat, in his attempt to work together with the communists, he is kidnapped by the Red Brigades, by the terrorists, and killed. It's like a huge tragedy of public Italian life. So that, opens the chasm between the new left and the communist left completely. And Nietzsche belongs to the anarchists, to the nihilists, to this kind of irrational youth culture, which for somebody like Montinari could be either left or right wing. It's like accidental where you lean towards. If you are, if you turn out to be a neo-fascist or like a left-wing terrorist, there's not so much difference for somebody like Montinari between these two. And that's why he is shocked how Nietzsche, that he wanted to purify from his political appropriations through the right-wing political movements of the interwar period, is repoliticized this time by a radical left that has broken with the Marxist and the socialist legacy.
Interesting. So in a way, he couldn't see it coming, and he has maybe regret, or what was his feeling there? Was it because Colli's position would be, we must keep Nietzsche as an anti-political figure, subtracted? I would assume this is his position. So perhaps Montinari started in his later years, as he witnesses what the infusion of Nietzsche is actually doing on the left. How would you characterize his position? Is he's conflicted? He sounds like he's very conflicted about this.
He is conflicted, and he is he turns into a melancholic. He would never regret to have redeemed Nietzsche from the editions that his sister made. He would never regret to have shown the real Nietzsche, as far as the real Nietzsche even does exist. But he can't accept the fact that his edition, even contributes to the new Nietzscheanism, which is deeply ideological, this time from the left. I would say Montinari, the late Montinari, has a strong sense of tragedy in the classical Greek sense. Colli had schooled him in this tragic sense of the classical Greek. So there is a certain fate of this edition, which it just can't be, unraveled to the one or the other side. It was not in the stars when they started this project that a new anarchist left, or libertarian left, as you also called it,
right,
would pick up Nietzsche as their kind of
right,
one of their main sources of inspiration. But of course, in the moment that it happens, it also makes complete sense, and Montinari understands that. So he really has a strong sense of tragedy, I think. Mm-hmm. And so his late life, and that is maybe not untypical for more than a handful of intellectuals in the second half of the 20th century. His late life is also characterized by a certain retreat from politics and a deeper immersion into the safe space of philological scholarship,
Right.
which is definitely accompanied by a deep melancholia and a sense of the tragedy of what's going on, because he remained all his life a communist, but in his later life he's definitely a reform communist. So in the end he's a good social democrat, if you want, the late Montinari. And this libertarian or even terrorist left is for him in a way betraying the left discourse in the worst sense.
So tell us, if we could pivot to, you see, because I think you mentioned that once Lukács's intervention in what's called the destruction of reason is made, many communists, especially in the GDR and let's say throughout the Soviet milieu, perceive Lukács's intervention almost as the definitive position that a communist should have to the Nietzsche issue. And there is a thinker that emerges. He's sort of a philosopher. He's also a journalist. He's also a public intellectual named Wolfgang Hartsch. And Wolfgang is this figure who takes his position that the left must be stridently opposed to Nietzsche. And you even say that this figure, Wolfgang Hartsch, as a theory that if the East, the communist East, reintroduces Nietzsche, that if that happens, this will signal a collapse in our values as communists. Could you say something about this very interesting figure who's not really well known, I think, in the Anglo-American context? Can you say something about him, please?
Yeah. Let me say one word about Georg Lukács first, because Hartsch is his scholar. And both Lukács and Hartsch, they have one thing in common. They were ardent Nietzscheans in their youth. I mean, also Lukács, when he wrote his early essays, then theory of the novel, things like that, he was deeply influenced by Nietzsche in content and form. And the same is true for Wolfgang Hartsch, who was a brilliant young Nietzsche scholar in the 40s. But then Lukács, after the war, he writes this book, The Destruction of Reason, which is kind of a genealogy of fascism, and becomes the official predominant interpretation of Nietzsche in the East. Because Nietzsche for Lukács is one of the main, the guys, deeply responsible for the destruction of reason, which for him leads to fascism. Among other things, because Nietzsche has, in a way, transfigured and in this way also betrayed the idea of the revolution. He has turned it from the idea of changing the society. He has he has moved it from a social level to, let's say, an existential level, and turn it into, so with Nietzsche, the bourgeois intellectual can feel revolutionary just by taking a certain aesthetic, just by making certain aesthetic gestures, and so the critique of bourgeois culture with Nietzsche, and we can read that in Lukács, makes a very important shift. Like, let's say, the bourgeois is not criticized as a bourgeois anymore, like the bearer of capitalism, a character which figures within an economic situation, but more he is criticized as a Philistine, as somebody who embodies certain values, and just by showing contempt for these values of the family, of truth, of a certain kind of social order, the young Nietzsche reader can feel revolutionary without actually changing anything. I mean, these discussions we have to this day within the left, you can take a certain radical chic, we might call it that way, and feel that you're destroying everything, but actually you're just living off your daddy's money, and one day you will also move into a middle-class career. So this we find in Lukács, and that turns into, in a way, the official version of reading Nietzsche in the East. And Harich is, in a way, repeating that. Harich is a tragic character because he's a brilliant intellectual scholar. He abandons Nietzsche very soon, becomes a vocational communist, like a communist that is, too serious for the GDR, let's say, because he has certain radical ideas. He criticizes the regime from the left, and he goes to jail. He spends quite a while in jail, and then they let him out again in the East, and they let him write to a certain extent, but they make sure that he, doesn't exert any social influence, any political influence, because he's this radical, leftist communist who criticizes the so-called real existing socialism for betraying the values of Marx and his followers. When in the 80s, we have in the West this Nietzsche Renaissance with the French philosophers and the new edition. And we also have like faint traces of a Nietzsche Renaissance in the East, very, very faint. Let's say the GDR opens a little bit in the 80s to its own cultural legacy. And suddenly it's interesting that this famous philosopher Nietzsche has been born in a small village in Thuringia, and then, they opened Little Nietzsche Museum in the 80s, and also in Weimar. Harich, who, has like a very fine, like a subtle sense of smell for these things, he sees the return of, reactionary thinking, and he launches this battle of against Nietzsche, which seems slightly lunatic in the 80s. And mainly he launches a battle against Colli and Montinari, who are still regular visitors to the archive in Weimar, and who are kind of friends of the house there. I mean, Harich in a way even goes so far as to claim that the edition of Nietzsche made by Colli and Montinari was responsible for the fall of the wall. Yeah? And what Harich claims is he attacks the authorities, the cultural authorities of the GDR, for betraying their own cause. Because as he says, Nietzsche was in their hands after the Second World War. Nietzsche, kind of the worst and most dangerous reactionary philosopher. Harich seems to think like whoever reads one page of Nietzsche is, turns into a fascist almost naturally. The most dangerous philosopher that ever wrote books was in the hands of the GDR by chance after the war, because all his papers were in Weimar. And then they gave them out to these two Italians who made them, like known in the world. He accuses the GDR authorities for having committed this betrayal. Harich even writes to Honecker and ministers of state in the late 80s. And that's kind of, let's say, the last attempt to reclaim this official anti-Nietzsche doctrine that goes back to Lukács.
Yeah.
But in the context of the 80s, it seems almost a bit ridiculous. And as we know, Harich also couldn't prevent the fall of the wall.
Well, I mean, it also seems very hyperbolic or very exaggerated to suggest that Nietzsche has that power. Because, I mean, I think if one studies Nietzsche's true political relation in his time, let's say, you know, how did Nietzsche, what did he say about socialism? What did he say about liberalism? I mean, he says many things. And often, actually, as Lo Sordo, who you mentioned earlier, shows. Yeah, Nietzsche says, my politics are best described as aristocratic radicalism. When somebody writes that about him, he confirms. Although, much of the time, Nietzsche is very much in favor of liberalism, in some sense. And I also think that the problem with Wolfgang Harich is that he almost is embracing an anti-liberal censorship position. So if you are afraid of Nietzsche entering into the discourse of intellectual life, why not allow it in, but then contest it on his grounds and to show? But instead, he's like, almost seems to be pro-censorship. Is that true?
Yes.
Or so his, how was that met? I imagine that in both East and West Germany, he probably got pushback because, I mean, who's going to be in favor of a kind of that position? I mean, it seems strange. I mean, even Lukács, when 68 in France occurs, Lukács was still alive, and he was horrified that the left had adopted Nietzsche. But I think that the problem is not to me, speaking personally, if you have an anti-Nietzschean approach, it strikes me as too vulgar. It's not the right way to combat the problem of Nietzsche politically. There's different ways. But you see my point, like, was because Harich wrote this book, what was it, later in the 80s, right? Or maybe the late 70s. Could you talk about that as well? Where he tried to show the intellectuals of the left that, like, this is the reason why Nietzsche should not be brought back in. Was he? I mean, he obviously was not successful, but you also seems, Philip, to have some sympathy for him. Is that true? What's redeeming about his project?
Actually, for me, he's mainly a tragic character, Harich. And in the end, maybe he's only interesting as, let's say, a reincarnation of certain traits of Lukács' anti-Nietzschean stance. I mean, Harich publishes a lot of stuff in the 80s, most of it, but has only been published posthumously. He writes a lot of stuff which has been published posthumously because also the GDR authorities, they wanted to keep him small. You know, he is, let's say, a dissident from within, like a pure than the more communist than the communists. He is somehow a minor character. They even let him travel to the West because they know that he will come back anyway. He spends a few years in the late 70s in West Germany, and then comes back to the East. But he's a bit like, he's a Don Quixote figure in the 80s, you know, fighting against windmills, which he can't fight, definitely not after the fall of the war. But of course he is, I mean, in his whole exaggerated way, just symbolic for how the, you know, postmodern, post-structuralist Nietzschean left, you know, moved away from the course that the old left was steering and how it turned into really something else. I mean, I would be interested in your point of view, also from a standpoint of today, what a left can do with Nietzsche in these days. You know?
Yeah, this is my question. Yeah, this is because I find that the residues of, let's call it that, Lukácsian view have many merits, with the exception when they become purely anti-Nietzschean. Because you see, for me, Nietzsche is inescapable. Where I criticize the post-structuralist Nietzsche, right, this libertarian Nietzscheanism, is precisely, I think, some of the points that you were hinting at, which is that he sanctions or he encourages the left to abandon certain fundamental principles, even the class analysis that you articulated so well. I try to position Nietzsche as a sort of pugilistic figure who was interesting because he read a lot about political economy. He read a lot about the history of the French Revolution. He read a lot about socialism, and he criticizes it. I even show that Nietzsche was concerned about his own readers of the left. He has an aphorism against his left-wing readers. He takes on Rousseau. So, if you take a Nietzschean leftism, you extricate Rousseau, you remove Rousseau, you remove Rousseau's focus on equality. Nietzsche has such a fundamental hostility to the idea of equality. And there's nothing more monstrous, in my opinion, than a left who has abandoned equality, right? Or a left who has somehow determined that equality is right-wing. That's a monstrous proposition. So, but we have to take, I'm against that Wolfgang Harrich notion that he should be censored. I mean, we know the situation of censorship today and what it produces. It creates a paralysis in discourse, a paralysis of intellectual life. That's the last thing that should be done, in my view. So that was one point. I don't know what you think. Perhaps as a final question, we could ask you how you think about Nietzsche's place in the political spectrum.
I mean, first of all, I would say in the end, Nietzsche was not a political thinker. He didn't have a strong political sense, which also really, puts him in this very German tradition of Grecophilia, of valuing culture in the end higher than politics, something that, us Germans, we think about for 200 years. How do the Anglo-Saxons do it to be so natural, so naturally political human beings, seemingly, at least from a German standpoint, they always seem to be. Nietzsche was he didn't have a strong political sense. What he proposes in his late years as great politics, is some kind of deep cultural revolution. He thought he was dynamite, and just by reading his writings, this cultural revolution, completely turning around the foundations of the modern civilization that could maybe happen. Right. That's absurd from a political standpoint, from a truly political standpoint. But I would agree. I would agree to you when it comes to the left. So first of all, also nowadays that, and I can also understand that Nietzsche somehow was so important for a left, at least if I look at the West German case or also the Italian case, in these post-war decades, which almost seem to be post-political in the 70s and 80s. There was in West Germany not so much going on politically. I mean, internally, yes, of course, but in this liberal society without strong, or let's say a strong external danger or strong political issues, politics becomes existential and turns around questions of your own existence and your identity, all these things. Nowadays, where the landscape is changing so rapidly, first of all, I notice it with my students. We were reading Nietzsche the other day. They're basically not interested in Nietzsche. And they were a few years ago, still more. But now where we think, okay, we have warfare in Ukraine, in the Middle East, we have our democracies are in decay. We have these transgressors everywhere, mostly from right wing. So what can we do with Nietzsche? First of all, that's my general standpoint. But I agree with you. What Nietzsche introduced into the left, among other things, was a strong anti-authoritarian streak, and we can't go back to an authoritarian left. I mean, that's over. Or let's say, if it comes back, then it's dangerous. I wouldn't want to go there. So a left that does not apply certain Nietzschean insights about the dangers of authority, any kind of authority, and the merits of individual freedom into its considerations won't work anymore.
I mean,
I think that's what I would say. No.
That's very good. That's very good, because I think there's a whole. Nietzsche once said that he is creating an arsenal of concepts for rulers, or even you could interpret that almost for like a ruling class or something like this, in this notion of master morality. But this notion of Deleuze, which is that philosophy is about the invention of concepts, I think it's something that he gets from Nietzsche. And I also think that instead of this notion that we focus on a singular idea of Nietzsche, just like the eternal return, or even in Heidegger, you have this idea that there's a kind of crystallized, condensed thought. It's almost a single thought. I like to approach Nietzsche as actually I see your point that he cannot be reduced to a political thinker. However, I think also he has a nose for politics that is very ingenious. And I think also that the way we understand, like Thomas Mann, the anti-political Nietzsche, is correct. Only insofar as we understand the anti-political Nietzsche as an achievement of what I call a pacification of certain form of politics. So this notion of Wolfgang Harrich and Lukács, their idea there is that Nietzsche is a political thinker who, if he is successful, disables the class struggle, or the legibility of the class struggle. So in that sense, you're right. If Nietzscheanism is triumphant, it's not. We no longer have Marxist socialism, is one way to put it from the perspective of Lukács. So I'm somewhat in agreement with that view, but I also think that we live in a very unique moment, and it is interesting. Nietzsche will never go away. I mean, that's actually something that I think we should never encourage, some kind of let's abandon him, let's cancel him, because we live in this world of people trying to cancel others. Never would I want to suggest that, because we gain so much from him, so much. So when is the book out? How can people get the book? And what is your hope for readers? As a final question, an encore question, what would you like for this book to do in terms of conversations it starts, etc.?
I think, first of all, I would be happy if the book, which has a certain, I would be happy if people who read the book then are inspired to read Nietzsche or reread Nietzsche. Nietzsche figures in the book. There's a lot of also, you get a lot of quotes and Nietzsche sound. So I hope that would be inspiring to read Nietzsche again. I mean, the book was also a certain bet with myself, because I heard about this story about the two Italians, two Italian communist anti-fascists moving to the GDR in 1961, exactly when the wall was built, to go into this archive and to edit Nietzsche, who was supposed to be a fascist thinker in the East. And then they kind of delivered the textual basis for French postmodernism. That was just such an interesting story that I decided to write a book about it. But the book is also about editorial philology. And editorial philology is maybe at first sight the most boring topic that you could ever imagine, the most dusty topic. So the bet with myself was, on the one hand, I have this kind of Cold War thriller. Also the title of the book alludes to that, John le Carré. But it's a Cold War thriller about editorial philology. So would I be able to tell editorial philology as a thriller? That's the bet that I, inaugurated with myself. So I hope the book could be read with a certain that the narrative has a certain thrust to pull readers through, and that then they would go back to reading Nietzsche himself. Because,
and for folks that that speak only English, or that are not prepared, because obviously even if you have a rudimentary reading of German, reading Nietzsche is a whole another question. Who's the best translation source?
That you know better than me. I know that the Colli Montinari edition has been translated into English, and I think it's a very good translation. Yeah. But of course, I still also value Walter Kaufmann, who was a very important liberal Nietzschean post-war in the United States. He is also figures in the book. And he wrote, I think, still very readable books about Nietzsche. And he made very good translations also of many of his works. So either or. Kaufmann is definitely very readable, but the translation of the Colli Montinari edition is also very good. So Nietzsche in English works fine for me.
Okay. Philip, thank you so much for joining me and for this very, very enlightening and insightful conversation. This has been, I know that my audience will find this of great interest. So thank you so much for your insights and for your time. And thank you for writing this wonderful book. I'll link to it in the show notes so people can buy it. When does it come out in English? Is it already out?
It's out in the UK. And I think it will be out in the US very, very soon, within June, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Fabulous. Okay.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Likewise.
Okay.